Thank you, Sydney. And thank you everyone for joining CAA for today's update. For those who participated in our last webinar in August, welcome back. And we're looking forward to walking you through our updates today. For those who may be new to Circular Action Alliance CAA, my name is Olivia Barker, and I lead CAA's stakeholder and producer engagement and communications efforts. I'm joined by my colleague, John Haidt, who's going to present some of our slides, and he works with me on external engagement, as well as Shane Buckingham, who's one of our project leads and specifically responsible for our regulatory compliance and program planning work. John and Shane are going to jump in on a few different slides, and I will kick us off just with a brief reminder of why we're here and who CAA is before we get to the updates. But again, for those who are new and to set the stage early, Circular Action Alliance, or CAA, is a nonprofit producer responsibility organization. We'll refer to the producer responsibility organization as a PRO or PRO throughout. And this organization is working to ensure that new extended producer responsibility, or EPR, laws for packaging and paper can be implemented successfully and can help and to ensure that this organization can help producers meet their obligations under these new laws. We're going to do a brief recap of what EPR is, what a PRO is, and what we do in just a minute, and then we'll dive into our updates and our work in Colorado and Maryland. We'll start with where we have already been approved to be the single PRO to support and represent producers' interests. And then we'll also get into some of the developments in the regulatory processes and next steps for CAA in California, Oregon, and Maine. Next slide, please, Mark. So as I said, we're going to start with a quick refresher on EPR and who CAA is before we get into the state updates. We'll highlight new resources that we've developed to ensure that producers and other stakeholders are getting the latest information from CAA outside of these presentations. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. Just a few quick pieces of housekeeping. As I said at the beginning, this presentation is being recorded up until the Q&A section and will be shared with those who registered within a few days of the presentation. We'll do Q&A at the end. We'll try and reserve at least 20 minutes for those questions, if not more. We'll be utilizing the Q&A feature in Zoom. So please feel free to enter questions as they occur to you as we go here. We'll take them at the end. And we'll go through as many questions as we can. We may try and summarize or combine questions to make sure that we can get to as many as possible. And if there are specific questions that we don't get to, that we're not able to answer, or that we deem to be really industry or company specific, we will follow up with you directly with an answer after this. So again, this is not the last chance to ask questions. We do have an email address, info@circularaction.org, which we'll show you on our last slide, and you can feel free to email any additional questions to that. Last disclaimer is just the Q&A session at the end here is designed for stakeholders, not media. We haven't restricted access to this forum in any way, but we just ask that media follow up with any questions that they may have. And you can either use that info@inbox or media@circularaction.org. So next slide, please, Mark. And I'm going to immediately ask you to go to the next slide. So for those of you who may be new to this topic, EPR is a policy approach that makes the entity that puts a product into the market, in this case, a product that uses packaging, responsible for the costs and management of that product or packaging at end of life. The US passed its first packaging EPR laws in 2021, but there are examples of other EPR programs, also known as stewardship programs, for other products like electronics, paint, mattresses, prescription drugs, sharps, and batteries that predated these new laws. So we always start with the disclaimer that while the US laws for EPR laws for paper and packaging are oriented around the same principle of shifting the cost of recycling from municipalities and consumers to companies, also known as producers, we'll use that word interchangeably. There are some differences between the EPR laws for paper and packaging that have been enacted in the US. And some of those differences include how much of the cost is put on producers, if producers are paying just for system improvements, or if they're paying for all recycling system costs. Other differences include what materials are covered, and even who is defined as producer and obligated to pay into these programs to have their material managed responsibly under these systems. Generally, in terms of the producer definitions, the EPR laws that we are talking about today require brand owners, so think of that as those whose name is on a product, to either partially or fully fund the collection, sortation, and processing of the packaging that they use for their products. In cases where there is not a clear brand owner in the US, this responsibility falls to retailers or first importers of the packaged product or packaging like item into the US. Again, every state has a slightly different definition of producers and materials covered under its law, and we're not going to do a deep dive on those definitions today. We would encourage companies that have obligations or expect to have obligations to consult with their legal and regulatory teams and do a close review of the laws to determine where you fall against these definitions. As you will hear later today, however, several states are starting on or in the middle of their rulemaking processes, and we expect those processes to provide some clarifications on these definitions, as well as the packaging and material types covered under each law. So how are producers going to manage all of this and determine what they owe and how they can ensure that their packaging is managed responsibly at end of life? Well, most of these laws require producers to form and join a producer responsibility organization, again, a PRO, and that organization's job, our job, is to support compliance in the achievement of higher recycling rates and other performance targets that are outlined in the law. Most states will only approve one PRO at the beginning of the program, and typically that PRO must be a 501c3. So Oregon is the only state that allows for multiple PROs at the beginning of the program, and that's provided that each PRO represents at least 10% of the market. The producers supporting the organization, the PRO, have to represent at least 10% of the market. The responsibilities of the PRO and the organization's ability to manage different elements of the recycling system vary under each law. Some states give the PRO more operational responsibilities than others, but at a high level, the PRO has to develop a program plan that includes how the organization plans to collect and manage producer fees. And again, producer fees typically fund collection, sortation, and processing, with some exceptions, and that's primarily for material and residential programs and occasionally material and commercial programs. They may also fund other critical activities that support system performance and achieving the objectives, such as consumer education and outreach. Producer funds are usually based on tonnage and the cost of actually managing that material in the system. And then there are additional incentives layered on top to encourage the use of things like more recyclable packaging, the incorporation of recycled material, and other environmental considerations that minimize waste and other impacts. Many of these laws were conceived with the idea of not just managing, but designing out waste, and producers are incentivized to do so via reduced fees for certain packaging choices. Next slide, please. So where do these laws exist? I want to be very clear. This is not a heat map. This is not showing pending legislation. This is just showing where we have the 4 states that have passed laws that create actual EPR programs for paper and packaging, as well as a few states that have passed either study bills or in the process of doing needs assessments that could pave the way for future EPR laws. So you see here that our states that have the EPR laws on the books are California, Colorado, Maine, and Oregon. And then I mentioned those states with study bills. I've heard those referred to recently as pre-PR bills. And these require the state, sometimes in consultation with an advisory council, to make recommendations again on what a future EPR program should look like. Some states conduct needs assessment as part of this process, and sometimes without a mandate to provide legislative recommendations. So that is New York is also conducting a needs assessment at the moment that isn't necessarily attached to legislative recommendations. But again, the needs assessments are really designed to determine, what does the current recycling system look like in the state? What materials collected and processed, at what cost, and what are the operational improvements and capital investments needed to make the system operate better and address gaps? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, CAA is a nonprofit PRO that is formed in response to the laws that have been enacted and to help producers comply with these laws. In the spring of 2022, a group of companies saw several of the laws that had passed and saw the requirement for producers to form a PRO in several state laws. And they decided to take early action to stand up an organization with the goal of creating a best-in-class organization that could serve producers across multiple states to help drive efficiencies while ensuring that we are responding to and implementing programs that reflect the very specific and unique needs in each state, as well as the differences in the laws, which we've touched on a little bit. The group saw in these enacted laws an opportunity to improve recycling system outcomes and to scale best practices across jurisdictions. And this is one of the reasons, many reasons, why CAA is working and hand in hand with these founding members that you see on the screen here to become an approved pro in all states that have enacted packaging EPR laws. We are grateful to the leadership of our founding members that you see here. Many of these companies have experience leading and participating in pros outside of the US, and those experiences have greatly informed the structure of this organization and how we are approaching each state law. The board has assembled a support team, project team members like myself and John and Shane and others who are, I think we're getting up to almost 40 team members now. All of whom have direct experience building pros and developing and implementing program plans in other markets. And this has allowed us to hit several milestones over a short period of time, including being selected as the single pro to help administer Colorado's EPR law. That happened in May. And then just last week, we were selected as the single pro to represent producer interests in Maryland and serve on the advisory committee that will evaluate and recommend a future EPR program for the state to the government and the legislature by the end of next year. Next slide, please. Great. So we're now going to, that was a really quick overview building off of some of the overview of the organization that we provided last time. And now we want to get into some state-specific updates. So we're going to start with Colorado. I'll start there, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Shane to walk us through Maryland and California, and then John to touch on Oregon and Maine. Next slide, please. So Colorado's law was signed in June 2022, and this state was the first of all the states to approve a pro, and again, that happened this past May. So Colorado's law requires producers of packaging, paper products, and food serviceware to join the pro, CAA is now the pro, and cover 100% of the collection, processing, and recycling or composting costs for covered materials. So in Colorado, our first step after being approved was to put out an RFP for the needs assessment. That is overseen by us, by the pro, with the state Colorado Department of Health, Public Health and Environment, as well as the state-appointed advisory board's input. And it is required by law that we have a third party do that work. And because we had done significant work to prepare for implementation prior to being approved, recognizing the very tight timelines within the Colorado law to complete this needs assessment, we were able to move forward with our selection of HDR Engineering in partnership with Eunomia Research and Consulting to get to work on that needs assessment starting in early August. And so these consultants, along with our Colorado team, have been hard at work gathering data, having lots of conversations, doing site visits, and preparing to complete the needs assessment for CDPHE review at the end of January of next year. Again, as I mentioned on a previous slide about needs assessments, the needs assessment is an in-depth study that will look at Colorado's existing recycling system and identify opportunities for growth and improvement of that system. It's meant to provide the roadmap for the PRO's approved program plan ultimately, in addition to informing the rulemaking process. The needs assessment includes key components of a successful recycling program, such as consumer access to recycling, processing capacity, end market availability, and more. In the needs assessment, we are also required to propose 3 different scenarios for increasing collection and recycling rates, and then outlining the targets that we could meet by 2030 and 2035 and the associated operating and capital costs. So following the submission of the needs assessment, which will include those three program scenarios, CDPHE will have a state-led public comment period and will ultimately recommend one scenario to the Joint Budget Committee of Colorado's legislature. And that scenario will need to be approved so that the pro can begin developing detailed program plans against that scenario and ultimately implement the program. Next slide, please. Just wanted to do a quick click down on the needs assessment timeline. We've just spoken to some of those dates at a high level, but you can see here that we're now at the analysis, modeling, and fact-checking stage, following a busy period of gathering information from both primary and secondary sources. Our work over the past couple months included surveys, interviews, facility site visits, including a review of reports and other data sources. The team held information sessions with municipal governments and with waste management companies, and has appreciated all of the feedback received to date, both via a formal survey that went out in informal interest form. So many thanks to those who've participated in that process. In terms of how to contribute to the needs assessment moving forward, knowing that now we're really working to analyze what we've heard and develop that needs assessment, we will always be open to new information to inform the work. But we are moving out of that information gathering stage to analysis and modeling. So as we do that, we will be seeking feedback through the state-appointed advisory board, and welcome direct contact with CAA if there's anything that you want to add to ensure that we have as complete a picture as possible as we're putting together that assessment. Next slide, please. Great. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Shane.
Thank you, Olivia. And so as Olivia pointed out earlier in the presentation, Circular Action Alliance was recently approved to be the producer responsibility organization to represent producers in Maryland. So pleased to have that appointment, and we will be taking a seat on the Maryland Producer Responsibility Advisory Council. And as part of the role of the Pro representative on that advisory council, we will be providing advice on the development of EPR legislative recommendations that will be informed by a needs assessment. So there can be up to 21 members represented on the Producer Responsibility Advisory Council, and that will include a broad range of stakeholders to provide feedback on those recommendations that will then go to the governor. And there will be a needs assessment that will, unlike Colorado, be conducted by the government of Maryland and will inform the work that the advisory council does and the recommendations that will be made to the governor by the end of next year. You can go to the next slide. So this needs assessment, I think, Circular Action Alliance is well positioned to provide feedback on a needs assessment process in Maryland, given the experience that we have gotten so far in Colorado, as Olivia has highlighted. But this needs assessment has specific requirements outlined in the law, and the consultant that is ultimately retained by the government of Maryland for the needs assessment will need to analyze the solid waste and recycling streams, evaluate current infrastructure gaps and costs, assess processing facility worker conditions, wages, and benefits, assess opportunities in the recycling system for women and minority individuals, evaluate local government requirements for multifamily and commercial recycling services, assess recycling education programs, evaluate economic opportunities for the state's recycling system, make recommendations to deliver equitable outcomes for underserved populations, assess the costs, benefits, and environmental impact of EPR, and provide recommendations on best practices from other EPR programs in other states or countries. So as part of that needs assessment, the consultant must consult with the advisory council, local governments, regional waste management organizations, and producers in the state. So we are awaiting an announcement on the advisory council, and we'll look forward to providing our perspective in that process on EPR recommendations in Maryland. Moving to California, so you can go to the next slide. This is where we have been spending a lot of time as an organization to ensure that we are prepared for the producer responsibility application process, which is due by January 1st, 2024. SB 54 was enacted in June 2022, and California's EPR law requires producers of residential and commercial single-use packaging and plastic single-use food serviceware to form and join a PRO to manage materials and to support and fund the cost of the recycling system. There are additional requirements for the PRO in California that is ultimately selected through the application process, and that is to ensure that 100% of packaging in California is recyclable or compostable by 2032. We also have a unique requirement if we are placed to be the producer responsibility organization in California to source reduce plastic packaging by 25% and then meet a 65% plastic covered material recycling rate by 2032. So in addition to that, there are certain requirements around how we will, set fees and the eco-modulation of fees. But another component in overall funding that the PRO must provide is remitting $500 million each year, starting in 2027 and ending in 2037 to the California Plastic Pollution Mitigation Fund. So Circular Action Alliance has been, looking at all the different discussion papers that have been released by CalRecycle, evaluating how best to implement under SB 54 and providing constructive feedback on achieving the goals of SB 54. We are also evaluating the PRO application and most recently attended the workshop that CalRecycle hosted to discuss the PRO application, which is due on January 1st, 2024. Also on January 1st, 2024, CalRecycle will be publishing the list of covered material categories. You can go to the next slide about the PRO application. So as highlighted, the timing obviously has us busy working on the application itself to be prepared for the submission of that application on or before January 1st. We will need to highlight, as we have done both in Colorado and Maryland, in those PRO application processes, the experience and qualifications of the organization and the team that's been assembled to establish and operate PROs, as well as the list of the producers that we're representing and the brands that those producers also represent. In terms of governance, we'll be listing voting and potentially non-voting members with term lengths and lists of covered materials represented. In Colorado, we have a state board. So there's a national board and there's also a state board. We are currently evaluating how to set up our governance for California with a state board, and that will be supported through Circular Action Alliance's governance committee. On implementation, the focus will be, again, to demonstrate the capabilities of the organization to effectively implement SB 54 and those goals around recyclability, source reduction, and recycling rates, as well as the commitment of the organization to environmental and social justice. As a new organization, there's also work that we're undertaking as a startup on financial information, so the financial controls, policies, and procedures. And the organization's finance, investment, and audit committee is busy working on those components of the application. So it is our intention to have that application prepared and to submit it ahead of time. And we are working with our members and engaging stakeholders currently on fleshing out our vision and for the implementation of SB 54. And I think I'm going to be turning it back to John now.
Thanks so much, Shane. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Mark, if we could go to the next slide. So I'm going to be doing a quick overview of Oregon's program and some next steps from Circular Action Alliance's perspective in Oregon, and then we'll flip over to Maine. Generally speaking, Oregon's program is really a shared responsibility program that focuses on packaging, printing, and writing paper and food serviceware. I won't go into all of the different details here of the different requirements under the Recycling Modernization Act or the RMA. They're quite extensive, and I'm sure many of you have been following closely with the rulemaking process and DEQ's great webinars that they've been hosting as they unpack both the rules and the RMA requirements. But generally speaking, pros in Oregon's program are required to pay an average per ton processing fee to material recovery facilities or commingled recycling processing facilities in Oregon, as well as a per ton average contamination management cost. In addition, pros are also required to manage a specific list of materials that are currently being considered through the DEQ's rulemaking process. There are also some requirements on pros to fund local government contamination reduction programming, education work, and there's also a waste reduction grant program as well. I may be missing a couple of specifics, but please, refer back to both our website and DEQ's website for all of the different program details here. There are not specific performance standards for all materials under the RMA, but there are specific recycling rate goals for plastic packaging and for plastic food serviceware. These are 25% by 2028, 50% by 2040, and 70% by 2050. I have mentioned pros a couple of times. Oregon is the only state in the US that does allow for multiple producer responsibility organizations to operate. In order to operate, each pro must have an approved program plan through DEQ and the Advisory Council in Oregon, in addition to having a 10% market share. So that, we're thinking very closely, and we've been in communication with DEQ about sort of what that multiple pro environment might look like if multiple pros submit program plans in next March. That process would kick off in April. CAA is intending to be a pro in Oregon, and we did submit a letter of intent on September 1st of this year. So in terms of a couple next steps in Oregon, CAA has been, really involved in the first round of rulemaking, the phase 1 rulemaking process that kicked off last year. We've been following that process closely. We have a representative who is sitting on the second phase of the rulemaking advisory committee, and Doug is also sitting on the commingled recycling processing facility technical working group, which is currently meeting on a fairly regular basis to work on a number of issues. The final phase 1 rules the drafts are out. They've been through a comment period, and they will be heading to the Environmental Quality Commission for a hearing on the 16th and 17th of November. This first round of rulemaking is focused on a number of different issues, but includes pretty critically the material recycling lists that I mentioned, both one that governs the materials that can be commingled by local governments and receive both that processing and the contamination fee reimbursement at material recovery facilities, as well as the pro list. There are also some rules that govern sort of how pros are meant to operate, as well as convenience standards, among other issues. The phase 2 rulemaking process, like I mentioned, has already kicked off. That group is covering a number of different issues, including living wage, including permitting for material recovery facilities, including an LCA process, and where LCAs are required throughout the RMA, exactly how those LCAs are meant to look, and the processes that will shape that. And that process runs into next year, again, with the rules likely promulgated in November of next year. I mentioned that CAA is working towards the submission of a program plan by March 31st of next year. That work is well underway. We have begun engaging with a lot of different stakeholders in Oregon, including many of the commingled recycling processing facilities and the haulers and local governments. We attended the Association of Oregon Recyclers conference a couple of weeks ago and had a number of excellent meetings with folks, and we intend to continue engaging and understanding and collaborating, because we really recognize that the RMA in particular is going to be a joint undertaking, and we look forward to working closely with everyone in Oregon. Mark, if we could go on to the next slide. So lastly, just to do a quick overview on Maine and CAA's engagement with the Maine program. Similar to Oregon, Maine is also a shared responsibility program. The law requires that producers of consumer packaging, and this doesn't include food serviceware or paper, we're just talking about packaging here, join a stewardship organization. Stewardship organization will enter into a 10-year contract with Maine DEP. That RFP for that contract will be released sometime in the fall of 2025. And under that program, there are a couple of primary costs that the stewardship organization will be managing. The first is to fund municipal reimbursements for their management of consumer packaging. The second is to invest in and fund improvements in the recycling system in Maine. And the third is to fund education throughout the state. Critically, the state is going to be developing a list of material that is readily recyclable and material that isn't readily recyclable, and that will guide how reimbursements are made to municipalities, as well as how fees are charged to producers. A critical task that'll happen right at the get-go once a stewardship organization is appointed through that RFP process that Maine DEP will be running is that the stewardship organization will conduct a needs assessment, and that needs assessment then will guide the development of the larger program rollout, producer fee development, and the reimbursement process for municipal governments in Maine. The Maine DEP does expect to appoint a stewardship organization in early to mid 2026. And once that organization is appointed and CA does intend to bid on that RFP, the recipient of the bid will then have 6 months to pull together both the fee schedule for producers and then to start charging producers fees and to build that off of reporting by producers. Maine DEP has been running an informal stakeholder process for the past year to bring input into their rulemaking process. They've released 3 large conceptual draft rule documents over the past 2 months. Those are currently available for review and comment on Maine DEP's website. They are accepting feedback on those for just a couple more days until the end of this month, and then their formal rulemaking will kick off in December of this year, with major substantive rules promulgated likely in the spring or summer of 2025, so just in advance of release of that stewardship organization RFP. Olivia, with that, I'll pass it back to you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, John. And Mark, you can go to the next slide, please. So we're seeing the questions in the chat. We're taking note of them. We will. I see a lot of questions related to timelines and joining CAA. So just rest assured that we'll get to those in just a moment. But I think related to that, we wanted to share some new resources that we have developed since our last presentation in early August. So I want to say that, and I apologize because sometimes I use Teams, and I think on Zoom you can't actually click on links. I may just not have figured out that feature yet. In Teams, sometimes you can. We will make sure that in our follow-up note with the recording, all of these links are shared with you. But one of the things we wanted to highlight was the expansion of our website. So we now have dedicated pages for California, Colorado, Maine, Maryland, and Oregon. This certainly doesn't have all of the detail that is in the laws, nor all of the detail that is necessarily on the state agencies pages, but it does include, they do include key deadlines and milestones, state-specific FAQs, really oriented around, producer registration deadlines, what producers need to know, as well as updates on where we are in the regulatory and rulemaking processes, which we will be diligent about updating as things change and as more information becomes available. We also have a new producer resource section that has some general FAQ, things that we're hearing in webinars like this and one-on-one conversations. And again, we'll sort of look at the questions we get in these sessions and continue to update that page with more information so that everyone has the latest. There are a few other things that we are highlighting in that producer resources section. One thing here you see on the side is that we recently released a producer survey as a first non-binding step in the producer registration process. And this is, again, somewhat informal, and it is primarily so that we can understand where companies expect they will have obligations to ensure we are feeding them, timely and up-to-date information as there are key updates and as some of the definitions and clarifications happen through rulemaking. So completing this survey also ensures that you will receive invitations to our new producer working group, which I mentioned slightly down the slide there. And that group is going to meet for the first time on November 1st. Working group participation is limited to companies that expect to be producers. So, you know, if you're reading the laws and you believe that your company would meet the definition, we welcome you to register. There is no cost associated with registering. We're going to continue to do these kinds of presentations and webinars for all stakeholders, but this is really an opportunity for us to get a bit more in the weeds with helping producers understand what's coming down the pike for them in all of these states. You know, there's an element of supporting producer preparedness, particularly as we approach periods where additional information and data may be requested from you. We're not looking for that information now, but we want to ensure that we're doing the education so that when the time comes, you have a solid understanding of what CAA is asking for. And why, to help you meet your compliance obligations. It's also just a great opportunity to educate yourselves and your colleagues on the concepts that are being debated state to state. I think one of the things that we've heard loud and clear is that not everyone has the time or resources to be sitting through full day workshops and rulemaking processes. And so we're very happy to bring you our learnings and takeaways from those processes, as well as start taking input to ensure that we are building positions and program plans that are reflective of the needs of the broader producer community. Monthly newsletters mentioned here too. You can sign up for that on our website. Again, we'll send around the links. That's going to go out monthly, as I noted, and will just be a summary of sort of key updates, any need to know information for producers and stakeholders, as well as a quick blurb on the state of play in each state. I will say before we jump to questions here that our obligated producer survey also creates an option for sending a letter of support for Circular Action Alliance to accompany our application in California. I think, you know, if you are inclined to support this organization, if you appreciate the information you've received to date, if you believe that this is the right organization for the job, and if we would very much appreciate your signing a non-binding letter of support. There's nothing in the producer survey that commits you to that. There's no risk of accidentally doing it. Essentially, if you check that you'll be a producer in California in full transparency, you will be sent an email asking you if you would consider a letter of support, and there are steps you would need to take to complete that, a DocuSign link. So don't worry about inadvertently getting support before you're able to vet it in your organization. But if you are, we would very much appreciate that support, and it would mean that your name would be included in a list of companies that we put on our application to Cal Recycle. Again, non-binding support could be retracted for any reason at any time. And it is not a requirement to participate or to receive updates and information from us. So I think with that, we can go to Q&A. Maybe, Mark, we can just go to the last slide here, just so people can capture, if you don't know where to find us either on the web or via email, there's a few places here. We're posting updates to social media as well. And we'll just stay on that for a couple seconds while I kick us off with some questions. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions